Okay, welcome to Labor Online author interview. I'm here today with Jacob Zumoff, and this is our first attempt. Our collective has decided that we're going to do more of these in-person interviews, so I was glad Jacob agreed to that. And we're here to talk about his book, which I will share and then ask him to introduce himself. Called his new book, The Red Thread, the Passaic Textile Strike. So Jacob, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jacob Zumoff, and I am an assistant professor of history at New Jersey City University in Jersey City, New Jersey. And I just published a book on the Passaic Textile Strike.
And your previous work was on the Communist Party, the early Communist
My previous work, my doctoral dissertation, and then my previous book was on the American Communist Party in the 1920s and its relationship with the Comintern. So when I was working on that book, and then I was commuting to work every day and driving through Passaic, New Jersey, I figured there's a bigger story to be told. And so my work on Passaic kind of came out of my earlier work on the CPUSA in the 20s.
Great. And so tell us briefly why you thought that we needed a new book on the Passaic Strike. I mean, I think in the book you say everybody has mentioned it, but why is it warranted? Why do you think it is? And then what are the key things that you think should make people pick this book up and add to their knowledge about this era?
Sure. Well, part of it, the strike itself, as you said, is not unknown. People have known about the strike for almost 100 years. And most labor history books of the 20s or that deal with it mention the strike, but there really isn't a book-length study of the strike before my book. There was a doctoral dissertation that's unpublished from the 1950s, which is good for almost a 50-year-old doctoral dissertation, but I thought there's a lot more sources that could have been brought out. And as I mentioned, since I have many students who come from the area that the strike was affected, and yet there's almost a complete lack of historical memory of the strike. Mm-hmm. Most people remember or know about the Patterson silk strike of 1913, but even when I was working on the book, going to the library in Passaic, Clifton, a lot of even librarians had no idea what I was researching. And so that lack of historical memory was something that I thought warranted research. Why I think that the strike is important and why I think it's worth learning about. It was a huge strike. It was as many as 15,000 workers went on strike for a year. Half the workers were women workers, often very young women, and many of the workers were Central or Southern European or Eastern European workers. It was a massive strike in the middle of the 1920s, which is oftentimes seen as a very anti-labor period. We all know about the industrial struggles in the 30s. This is something that I think was quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. And so tell us a little bit about it. I mean, I don't even think we've mentioned the date so far. So orient us to.
Sure. The strike began in January 1926 and went on for 13 months. The last workers went back in February 1927. It took place centered in Passaic, New Jersey, although other cities in the same area were also affected, and it was mainly wool workers. Everybody knows about the silk industry in Patterson, but Passaic was one of the main centers of wool and worsted workers. And after World War I, in the 20s, the wool industry at least was facing hard times, and the employers wanted to drive down wages and make conditions worse in order to become more profitable. And it led the workers who were not in any union to want to fight back. And the only group of people who were really willing to give a leadership were affiliated with the Communist Party. And so it turned out to be a very explosive combination. And for 13 months, 15,000 workers went on strike. And I think it really galvanized the country. It kind of symbolized labor's power and struggle in a very, like I said, anti-labor period.
Mhm. So just, one of the things that really struck me about some of this is how much repression
Mhm.
there there was. I think people think they know, if they know a little labor history, that the South had massive repression. But I've just read 2 books about New Jersey, and yours just blew me away how much repression was going on in this eastern city.
Yeah, in the year of the strike, in the period of the strike, there were 900 people who were arrested. The cops continually attacked mass picket lines, arresting people. There was a order by the courts against picketing. Almost every leader of the strike was arrested repeatedly. And I mean, according to what I was able to find from the files of the ACLU, that the bail of the people arrested was more than $600,000, which according to my calculations is about $8.5 million by today's standards. So it was major repression. And part of what I try to argue in the book is, in some ways, that was not unique. That was the way that labor relations in the 1920s played out. And so the strike, I think, is very interesting in that regard, because there's all the documentation and it helps get a better picture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And can you tell us what workers did to sustain that if there was so much repression for 13 months? I mean, we think this is the era of injunctions and, well, it's over, but they didn't give up, even though they had this kind of massive.
Yeah, and the workers did not give up. They went on for more than a year. And a lot of that, I think, is due to their personal bravery, because many workers were willing to be arrested again and again. But I think that what's important besides that is the role of the Communist Party in organizing the strike. And so there are several things that I think were key. One of them is the Communist Party had its legal defense organization, the International Labor Defense, which became bigger the next year in the fight for Sacco and Vanzetti, but was able to connect the fight against repression to the fight to win the strike. Another aspect was another Communist Party affiliated group called the International Workers' Aid, which set up a relief campaign for the strikers. One of the things they did is they set up several, they called them stores, but they were in storefronts, and through donations from unions and others throughout the country, set up so that workers were able to get food, were able to get haircuts, were able to get clothing. And they did it as a way both of building solidarity and a way to keep the workers connecting their basic survival to the struggle of the strike. And it was amazing the amount of work that they were able to coordinate, and it helped maintain the momentum of the strike for, like I said, more than a year.
I mean, when people think of the Communist Party, they certainly think of a top-down, Stalinist, organization. But what I see you drawing out here is that they were trying to bring back to life democratic strategies in this context.
I think that the Communist Party in 1926 was at an interesting point, because it hadn't yet become the Stalinist party that most of us think of. And in many ways, the strike shows the potential of the Communist Party, I think, in the 20s. But they really did make an effort to draw out workers in the strike, including putting forward workers, including young workers, women workers, to be leaders in their own area of work. And so I think that the CP both provided a broader political strategy, but also a way that workers in the strike were able to actually assert some control over
Mhm.
their own struggle. And it was quite impressive.
Mhm. And one of the things that I thought about when reading your book is that, you know, a lot of these methods were things that became are associated with the CIO. So what is your
Mhm.
perspective about the connections or what are disconnecting connections with the
Well,
CIO?
I think that there are definite connections with the CIO on a broad level. The idea that the Passaic workers were fighting for an industrial union that organized all workers, regardless of an ethnicity or regardless of skill, obviously would have reverberations in the 1930s. And also the idea that the main slogan of the strike was organize the unorganized.
Mhm.
Uh, and a lot of the tactics, I think, were very similar, including building massive picket lines with thousands and thousands of workers. And another important aspect is the role of leftists in the union leadership. The CP, and in the 1930s, for example, in 1934, you had all types of leftists, the CP, the Trotskyists, the Mustyites in various places. And I think a lot of that was using strategies and politics that had been kind of learned or at least put in motion in the Passaic strike. So I think that in many ways, the Passaic strike, you could see kind of an outline of the labor struggles later on, obviously in a very different context.
Right. And I mean, sometimes people think or argue that the Popular Front was what gave the communists some leverage, that they were able to moderate their demands. I think I see kind of the reverse in your argument. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, I think that what the Passaic strike shows is that a lot of the strength of CP came from its connection to worker radicalism. And that, I mean, one of the biggest difference I would argue between what was happening in Passaic and later on in the Popular Front is their attitude towards various politicians, for example. One of the things, I mean, during the strike, the Passaic strike, there were various attempts by both Democratic and Republican politicians to try to get involved and work out a solution. And the CP didn't ignore them, but it was very clear that workers' power comes from their organization and from the picket line. And I think that gave the strike a lot of power. And I think in the later 30s, during the Popular Front era, a lot of that was reversed in the attitude that the CP took. So I think that there's so I thought that's one of the chapters of my book on the politicians, and I thought that it's quite interesting to look
Yeah.
at.
You know, along those lines, in terms of the relevance of this book too, a lot of people think that, or hear this a lot, that these big plants, industrial struggles that are called, you know, in the Fordist type of system with mass workers, that you can't draw lessons that connect to the present. And I just wonder whether you think there are things that can inform us, or do you think that's true, that this is a thing of the past?
No, I definitely think that there are lessons. I mean, the immediate context, I don't think that we're ever going to see a wool industry in the United States like there was in the 20s. But there are still huge factories, or if not factories, then distribution centers, for example, not that far from Passaic. You know, there are Walmarts and there are Amazon locations, and a lot of the workers are, I think, relatively speaking, in similar situations. I mean, Passaic today is not Eastern European; it's largely Latin American. It has actually one of the largest Mexican populations in the area. But I think that the same, it's kind of like the same question of the need to organize unskilled workers, divided by language, divided by class, or not divided by ethnicity, and the importance of kind of channeling that worker militancy, and that's what I think is one of the things that's lacking. And one of the things I found inspiring about the Passaic strike is that in many ways the 1920s resemble the current period, which I think has the lowest unionization rate since the 1920s. And it showed a way forward, in my opinion, of how the labor movement was able to reverse that. Not in the Passaic strike, because the Passaic strike was defeated, but kind of a model that would later be taken up, like we said, in the 30s.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot to learn from it, not in the immediate details, but in the broader political perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, to me, one of the things you point out is how much they grabbed media attention. And can you discuss that a little bit?
That was a very conscious effort on the part of the strike leadership. And I think part of it's important to keep in mind that where Passaic is, it's within commuting distance from Manhattan. It's not in New York City, but it's close to New York City. And New York City was really the media capital. It still is, but at the point, the media capital of the United States. And so they made a really big push for reporters, but they all to cover the strike, but they also tried to, as we would say today, I guess, set their own narrative. They had a strike newspaper. They had artists and intellectuals. Mary Heaton Vorse was a big one who wrote constant press releases. She edited the strike paper. And one of the things that I mentioned the International Workers' Aid did is they made a film about the strike, which people can find on YouTube, I believe. And it was a way to popularize that strike. And what I was able to see through looking through the Daily Worker and through local newspapers is that they toured it around from city to city as far as California as a way to build solidarity. And they would have like the local musicians union would volunteer to play during the strike. The local local cinema workers union would show the strike, and they'd raise money.
So they had a worker to worker thing, or was it like the Communist Party touring it?
Well, I think it was the Communist Party certainly did tour it, and especially in New York City, a lot of the places, and in Chicago and other places that were big CP or relatively big CP strongholds, they would have it at like ethnic fraternal organizations. But I also found that local unions in places where I don't think the CP was particularly strong would rent it for, or would borrow it for a showing. They might have some strikers who would tour around with them, and they would get support from local unionists who would donate money. And it was a way of kind of building the importance of showing solidarity with the strike.
And really demonstrating solidarity, and I think making workers see, or helping workers to see, that there was a chance for success, right? I mean, that's what I really note, in the last few decades. It just seems like everybody, just an example, that one day longer kind of motto, right? It's like, instead of actually demonstrating that you are really going to win, that it almost says, oh, one day longer, right? And maybe we'll get some relief coming in here. But they had a different bottom up kind of strategy than I think most people would have experienced in recent strikes, most recent strikes. There are some exceptions. Just on another note there, this was a time when the AFL expelled delegates, even if they were elected, because they're communists. So can you help people understand just what they were up against as far as being a left organization, helping to run a strike, and how that played out, and why it's important?
No, and that's a very important point. The AFL, we're talking about the AFL kind of in the immediate post-Gompers period. Gompers died in 1924, and William Green was the head of it. And it was extremely anti-communist. Anybody, as you said, who was known as an open member of the Communist Party, and many unions were expelled. And in Passaic, the AFL union was the United Textile Workers, which only wanted to organize skilled weavers and left the mass of tens of thousands of workers unorganized. So the CP kind of stepped into this breach, and they showed that through their United Front Committee, they were the only group that was willing to actually provide some sort of organization and leadership and support to the workers. And they met constant hostility from the American Federation of Labor and from the UTW. For example, the UTW and the state AFL.
Can you say what that is?
The United Textile Workers.
Okay.
Did not want, it told workers and other unions not to donate to the relief fund. And the New Jersey Federation of Labor was working with the governor, A. Harry Moore, to try to get the communists out of the union or out of Passaic. And that was kind of the attitude they had up until probably the fall of the strike, when it became so popular that they were unable to openly oppose it anymore. And eventually the United Textile Workers agreed to take over the Passaic workers. They then proceeded in the next several months to sell out the strike. But it was like really a grassroots movement in the AFL unions themselves, that it was so popular that the leadership felt that they couldn't, openly go against the strike.
Well, very interesting. We agreed that we would make this a short interview, but there's just so much more in this book. So congratulations on it. And I hope that people will pick it up and maybe use it in a class.
Well, obviously, I hope so too. I had a lot of fun writing it, and thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thanks so much.